Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week we begin our study of the book of BaMidbar, the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Torah. In Hebrew, the name of the book derives from the first key word or phrase in the first chapter of the book at the very beginning, and that word for us is BaMidbar, in the wilderness. This is where the narrative focuses our attention on the experience of the Israelites in the wilderness. However, we in English know the name of the book as Numbers. And the reason that it has the name Numbers is because the very first chapters of the book of BaMidbar concern the taking of a census. The numbers of Israelites, men aged 20 and up, who are capable of bearing arms, because in the wilderness, through their travels, they will have to fight their way through some territories and against some peoples who do not want to let them pass through. And the term numbers, in Hebrew pikudim, the word that's used in the context of the census, comes to us through the lens of the Septuagint, which was the early translation of the Torah into Greek. So we have kind of a contradiction in how we begin the book. Do we listen to the text, BaMidbar? This is going to be a story about in the wilderness, the travels of the Israelites in their 38 years of being in the wilderness, because this book picks up after 2 years? Or do we focus on the fact that the first few chapters are very much concerned with the military, with the military capabilities of the Israelites to defend themselves? Who will fight? And the number 600,000 that we find in our Torah comes from this census. How many men of fighting age and ability are there among the Israelites? Now, we can't take that number literally, because that would mean there were probably a good 2 million people among these 12 tribes traveling through this part of the world, the Wilderness of Sinai, for 38 years. It's a big number. Now, you can stand overlooking, say, the Arava Valley in what is today southern Israel. It's between Israel and Jordan, south of the Dead Sea. We know from archaeology and archaeogeology that a long time ago, this was an ocean. I myself found fossils of bivalves in the Arava. And we can imagine this horde of people crossing this valley. That's an awful lot of people. And I really don't think we need to worry too much about the accuracy of that number. It's a lot of people. It's a lot. But the book of Numbers of BaMidbar will cover the journeys, the learning, the experiences, and also the point of view of the priests who were responsible for much of this text long after the fact, as providing kind of a guidepost, how to establish a worldview, what kind of society should ancient Israel be, what should it have been in the eyes of its spiritual leaders, what are the values, what are the rituals. So that will occupy much of this book. But I'm very interested in this notion that we have two different approaches that are available to us. And we know from scholarship, from modern scholarship, that um, there are a number of major sources that were woven together to form the text of the Torah. And that concerns a lot of people, makes a lot of people anxious, because for much of our history, right up into about the 19th century, um, we were all taught that the Torah is a single work, a uniform, unitary product. And in the Orthodox world, that is still true. And any suggestion that it is not is very threatening. However, it also teaches us that we can read, when we read and study the Torah, we can read on many levels, that we can read with a historical perspective, and we can read with a spiritual perspective. And the way that these perspectives are woven together by the redactor, who is kind of the editor's editor, um, to shape this into a single work, that there is value in seeing how all of these perspectives, all of these themes, all of these events are woven together into a narrative whole. And that's a view that is shared with us by Professor Nili Fox, who wrote the commentary on the Book of Numbers for the Jewish Study Bible. And she reminds us that modern scholars really are finding value in taking that step back to consider how these various parts were knitted together to form the whole. So just as Leviticus takes a very practical view of ritual and sacrifice and explains them in great detail so that the people will understand when they bring offerings, uh, why they bring offerings, what to do with them, what the offerings should be, how the priests will actually do the slaughter of the animals or the cooking of the grain. Very, very practical in that sense. But also, what is the worldview? What is the attitude of the ancient Israelites towards God, towards their world? What does the priesthood want to cultivate? What kind of spiritual society does the priesthood want to cultivate? So we find this in addition to what read for us as kind of historical narratives. We will encounter the story of the spies, um, and the result of their cowardice, their fear, is the 40 years of wandering, the total of 40 years, so that the um, generation who grew up in slavery will die off. So we will have historical narratives, but we also will see God interacting with the Israelites, God guiding them both in the form of the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. That is a visible symbol of God's presence to these people. We will see God's reactions to their fears, their anxieties, their, shall we say, less than spiritual choices. We will see God as a major actor through this book. We will see how Moses reacts to God and how Moses' leadership is not just tested, but how he grows as a leader, how he grows as a person. This is the book of Numbers, the book of the wilderness. And being in the wilderness will become a very important motif in our history, in our spiritual history, both on the national level, the level of the people, the ethnos, if you will, of Judaism. We call that Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, or Klal Yisrael, the entirety of Israel, but also uh, on the individual level. Sometimes being in the wilderness is a very potent metaphor and a very useful metaphor for our own trials and tribulations on a small community level and on a personal level. But we will see through this book how all of these things interact, how they are beginning to play out in this period between the major acts of liberation from bondage and revelation at Sinai, and in Deuteronomy, the final preparations for crossing over into the promised land. So there is much to engage our attention, and many scholars will remind us that part of the importance of the book of Numbers is that it reminds us that our faith is lived out in the everyday. We don't need all those big moments of liberation and revelation to guarantee our faith. We can be in covenant with God. We can be true to the teachings, the values of Torah every day in our ordinary lives. So that is also a message of the book of Numbers, BaMidbar. And perhaps you feel like this time in our health crisis is sort of like being cast out into the wilderness because we are away from society. And if you have that feeling from time to time, and I'm sure that many of you do because I know I do, remember that eventually we come through the wilderness. We come through and reach a destination that is a new place, a chance of spiritual renewal, of social renewal, of interpersonal community in a new sense, on a new level, with strength and with God's blessing. May that be so for us. I hope that you will continue to join me as we work our way through this book, BaMidbar, Numbers, and travel through the wilderness with our ancestors. I look forward to that, and I hope you do too. Shabbat Shalom.